In 1971, I was the press secretary to Senator Harold Hughes of Iowa. He had invited me to be his press secretary because he was running for president. It was a great honor. One night, Wes Michelson, who worked for the great man from Oregon, Mark Hatfield, was his chief legislative assistant, asked me to go to dinner with him, and I did. And he wanted me to know about a new organization that was just starting called Sojourners. That was 1971. In this country, there are any number of prophetic voices. And every day of our lives, we should be grateful for prophetic voices. There is none greater in America. There may be none greater anywhere on issues of social justice than our guest. His wife, Joy, was one of the first women ordained into the Church of England. They have two glorious sons, both of whom are outstanding baseball players. I have seen them play. And the oldest, Luke, as a sophomore in Washington, was voted to the All-Metropolitan Area Baseball Team. That's no small deal. In any event, he probably will say something about them. He is a very great friend. I love him dearly. I admire him greatly. Welcome, please, the one and only Jim Wallis.
Well, I have been to this church before, even if some of you haven't, and I always like to come back. I'd like to thank Craig Brown, the pastor, and Mark Trotter over here, who was the pastor for a long time here, and George, as a dear friend for a long time. You know, he always likes to come and come to my Little League practices. I was a Little League baseball coach for 11 years, 22 seasons. Remember the time he came to Luke's team and he told the kids he was a Red Sox scout. And they played the best they'd ever played. They just thought this was their chance. You mentioned Joy. It's Valentine's Day, so let me tell you a story about Joy Carroll, who was one of the first women ordained in the Church of England. We met at this big festival called Greenbelt Music. Bono got to start there. Music and discipleship and justice and all that. I was speaking and she was speaking. We met and got married and went back a few years later with our 4-year-old son Luke, who was already playing baseball, but he was 4 years old. And Joy was celebrating communion for 25,000 British young people. So she's up on the stage, and she's talking to people, they're talking back, and also with you and all the rest. And my son's looking at his mother on the stage and the people, and they're doing what she tells them to do, and he looks up at me and says, "Dad, can men do that too?" Joy and other women, we have a women rabbi tonight. Many women rabbis have been on this tour already, various places. They're changing the narrative, changing the imagination. A young boy, 2 young boys now, have a whole different view of what women can do and who women are. She's changed the narrative for lots of people. She was actually the script consultant to a British show called The Vicar of Dibley. So you might have seen. She's known in Britain as the real Vicar of Dibley. You love that show. One of your favorites, a rabbi's favorite show, Vicar of Dibley. I'll tell Joy, she'll be thrilled. Tonight she's in the Dominican Republic. She's an organizer. She organized the entire Wilson High School baseball team and young kids like Jack to do their spring training in the Dominican Republic, which is the best baseball. 28% of the MLB is Dominican. Their fields of dreams are cut out of sugarcane, not corn. And it's also a transforming cultural experience for all the kids and the coaches and parents. And I have to say, George, I remember last year, this time I was down there, and this only happens in some fields. There was this horse who was standing just in foul territory at the third baseline, but his rear end was just in fair territory. And nobody seemed to notice or care, and he was just standing there for a long time. So I'm sitting there and I'm wondering, what if a ball hit the horse's, rear parts and rolled fair? Would it be a fair ball or a foul ball? So I began to email all my baseball friends around America with this question. What would happen if the ball hit the horse? And of course, the one who figured out whether it would be fair or foul and wrote back was George Mitrovich. It would be fair, a fair ball. And he told me all about that. So let's start with baseball. Little League baseball coach for a lot of years. Every black player I ever had, whether they were low income or son of a top lawyer in DC, has had the talk from their dad or their mom, how to behave or not to behave in the presence of a police officer with a gun. They've all had the talk. None of my white players have ever had the talk, not one. And most of the white parents don't even know the talk is going on. What does it mean for white parents to care about the fact that their sons' teammates and schoolmates all have that talk and their kids don't? I wrote this book right after Trayvon Martin was shot and killed. And I knew that my son Luke, who is now not 4 years old, but is 17, 6 foot tall, playing college baseball next year, the whole nation knows that if Luke had been in Sanford, Florida, the same night, same time as Trayvon, doing the same things Trayvon was doing, the whole nation knows he would have come back to me and Joy. Trayvon didn't come back to his parents and is not going to college in the fall. We went to England for the Christmas holiday to see Joy's parents and family and our friends over there. And Jack, my 12-year-old, was very eager to tell all his family and friends that he is, at 12, 5'7.5". That half is very important. And they all said, Jack, you're so big and strong and athletic looking and impressive. No one said, you look threatening. While we were there, the news came across the pond that the police officer in Cleveland who shot young Tamir Rice would not face indictment or a trial. And I read the story sitting on a couch with my son Jack, and I read the prosecutor's language. He was a larger than average 12-year-old. He was 5'7.5". Jack Wallis had been in Cleveland, even holding a toy gun. By the way, you can conceal and carry in Cleveland. Would a white police officer have come up and shot Jack Wallis in 2 seconds before speaking to him? Does anybody really think that? People ask, what do you mean white privilege? I mean that. I mean that. Or as a young black man said in one of our meetings on this tour, he said, "If you don't see white privilege, you got it." So we've been having, instead of a book tour, we've been having kind of town meetings all over the country in places that I think have become parables. You know, Jesus told stories, parables to learn the right lessons from. So we've been to Baltimore, been to New York and DC, been to Chicago, been to Twin Cities, been just before we came here, we're in Atlanta. Before that, St. Louis and Ferguson. All parables that we need to learn the right lessons from. The title is indeed provocative, I'll admit that. Did it on purpose. America's Original Sin. Why? Because you've got 250 years of slavery, 100 years of legal segregation and discrimination and terrorist violence against black lives and bodies. 50 years of a civil rights movement, 7 years of a black president. But politics hasn't cleansed us of this. So I think we have to go deeper to the language of sin and repentance. Now, the original sin wasn't just slavery, because we've had slaveries before. I mean, the Romans had Greek slaves who taught their elite children. They respected their Greek slaves. They didn't break their families up. They didn't dehumanize them. But we've had slavery before. But this slavery was particularly venal, our kind. And I want to say, as a Christian, because of us Christians, British and American Christians, because we couldn't make our faith compatible with treating human beings like chattel property. But to build the biggest, most important, most effective, most valuable economic resource this country had, which were the slaves, that's how we're going to treat them. So instead of saying our faith isn't compatible with this, so we won't do it, we say, let's change what we say about who they are. Let's say they're less than human. Let's dehumanize these kidnapped Africans and those indigenous people that we took their land and lives from, and let's say they're really not like us. They're different. They're not fully human. And so if this seems old and historic and past us, it didn't to the young Ferguson kid who told me this year. I still feel like I'm treated like 3/5 of a person. Teenage boy feeling the shame of the 3/5 compromise written into the very Constitution of the United States. So we really didn't start with all men are created equal, whatever they meant by that. We're moving toward a more perfect union. No, we started with a principle, foundational principle, that black lives and brown lives matter less than white lives. The Black Lives Matter movement is a direct targeting of that foundational assumption. Black Lives Matter. Brittany Packnett, one of the powerful leaders in Ferguson, protest leaders, she was a leader of Teach for America, still is, in St. Louis, and decided to, at night, go to the streets with her students, face the rubber bullets and face the tear gas. And so Brittany, we saw her just 2 nights ago. Brittany tells me, we don't just need allies, we need accomplices. I like that. We need accomplices. How can we all be accomplices in this movement? The media is talking, and George follows this as closely as I do. The media is obsessed with the state of the race, political race, horse race. Now it's Scalia. It's always some. We're talking on this tour about the state of race in America. A tougher, deeper, harder, more difficult, and yet more important conversation. And even how that is affecting the state of the political race. So tonight, I'm going to say a few things, but I want to talk together. I want to hear from you. I want to have a conversation, a bit of a town meeting here in San Diego about these very things. So, how do we deal with the fact that it was mentioned before in the prayer by the rabbi that we were made in the image of God? This morning in a lovely church in LA, trying to become multicultural, multiracial, the average age in that church is 28. And it was everything. It was all of America in that church. That's where they're headed. And I preach from Genesis, how God created us all in our image, it says, God's image. To have dominion, meaning a better word for that, stewardship over all of the rest of the creation together. But when one people decides of dominion over another people, that just isn't a sin against them, it's a sin against God. It's a sin against God. And the whole idea of white supremacy, whiteness, really I would say the rightness of whiteness, the normality of whiteness, the entitlement of whiteness, the assumption of whiteness is not just an ideology, it's an idol based on illusions. I used to do training for anti-race training for whites in America. It was very funny. It's the people I'd like to now better call. Ta-Nehisi Coates says, those Americans who think they are white. That's a great line. Who think they are white. So I realize how we white folks don't much identify with our European ethnicity. We have a hard time going back to that. So I would tease them. I'd say, no, I can never tell you Italians from you Swedes. You're exactly the same personality. Or you Italians and you Germans. I just can never tell you apart. And they'd laugh and laugh. So, well, you must be the same because when you got to America, you all became white people. There were white people there, but now they became all white people. Meaning racially different and racially better and promised to be treated better than all those people of color who were already there or would be coming. Like this morning from Asia and Latin America and, of course, Africa. And here's the big deal in politics. The biggest fact, the elephant in the room, the reality that is most important to this country that nobody wants to talk about, because in just about 2 decades, we will no longer be, for the first time, a white majority nation. Most Americans will come from Africa, Asia, or Latin America. We will be a majority of minorities, and that is the bridge to a new America. So, America's original sin, racism, white privilege, and the bridge to a new America. When the book came out, there was a survey that got released, and it said, it was an amazing survey. I don't think much of most surveys, but this one was stunning to me. 72% of white evangelicals, well, we all know about them, white Catholics, and white mainline Protestants, white Christians, believe that the shootings of young African American men were, quote, isolated incidents. While 82% of black Protestants, black Christians, believe they were, quote, part of a pattern and part of their life experience. What does that racial divide mean? This book was written into that racial divide. What does it mean? For those who are Christians in the room, I this morning talked about how it says that in the body of Christ, when one part suffers, all the part suffers. Yet that's not the experience in white and black churches, white and black families. It isn't the experience that people have. How do we build this bridge to a new America? And I keep being asked about, and it's interesting how there's a section in the book called White Fragility. When us white folks feel uncomfortable, we often feel unsafe. We're not unsafe, we're just uncomfortable. White privilege, well, white baby boomer, that's me. And I got the biggest benefit from any affirmative action program in my nation's history. My dad was a naval officer, World War II. Came back, and all the veterans like my dad got a GI Bill, that's free education. FHA loan, that's your first loan for a house. And when you got education and a house, you're middle class. So the government, I'm going to say it again, the government made my family middle class. And the white GIs all got that, and the black GIs didn't. It's called white privilege. Well, my son's going to college next year, and we were figuring that all out, and we found this thing called legacy. Legacy. And a lot of schools, if your parents or grandparents went to the school, you get an advantage. It's called legacy. How does that impact most young black and brown students versus white students? Another young man in the crowd we had said, when you're used to white privilege, racial equality does seem like a threat, doesn't it? Or if you can't see it, you got it. So, how do we get theological about this? How does it become a moral issue? How do we take it to a deeper place? And the word repentance I learned from an imam in Chicago and a rabbi in Chicago. The word repentance in your tradition means the same as in our Christian tradition, which means not just feeling sorry. That's not it. It's turning around. Turning and going in a whole new direction. So that's what this book is trying to be about. The longest chapter is this bridge to a new America. How do we navigate these waters toward this amazing demographic change? How do we get set free from our idols? If it's an idol, this notion of whiteness, then it does separate us from God. What does it mean to put aside those illusions and those lies and be who we are, really, and not who we're taught we could be? And so I talk a lot about racial geography. Here's a stat that really struck me. 75% of us white Americans, 75%, have no significant black relationships in our social systems. 75%. That's why these percentages are so different. I remember I was out here, you remember, some of you older folks remember Rodney King and the video and the trial in Simi Valley and all that stuff. And so I was part of a World Council of Churches delegation to come out and find out what happened and why, as if we didn't know. And went to Simi Valley, and it's an affluent community. It was very famous now, Simi Valley, where the trial took place. But it wasn't just white, it was black, but affluent. And so we had two Methodist churches, one white and one black, and they had a dialogue. First time they'd ever talked or ever met, and we were there. And it was very intense. And this black mother stands up, the story's in the book. She says, I worry for my son because he's a member of the Los Angeles Police Department, and I worry when he takes his uniform off and goes undercover. And this white mother says, oh, I've got a son too. I can imagine how that must feel to be so scared about your son takes the uniform off. And he's got those gangs to worry about. The black man said, no, it isn't the gangs to worry about. I'm worried about the white LAPD officers and how they'll treat my young black son when he isn't wearing a uniform. And this white woman was just incredulous. You could tell she was astonished. She had never even imagined anything like this. And the question was whether the white mother would believe the story of the black mother. And there was silence in the room, and nobody was talking, and we were just wondering what was going to happen. Bless her heart, the white mother did believe the story of the black mother, and the conversation went very deep, very fast. What does it mean to cross each other's thresholds? King said it well. 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the nation, he said. Well, also 9 o'clock when kids go to school, and 6 o'clock when we have family dinners. And how do we overcome that racial geography? How in schools do we change that? In congregations. And I think sports is a great place where that changes, where people, as George knows so well, the best Democrat, white Democrat on race was Bill Bradley. Best white Republican was Jack Kemp, because they had teammates. And like my son Luke, they're best friends with their teammates. And some the stories of your friends matter to you. You're not talking about race, you're just talking about life and kids and hopes and dreams and health and bad stuff, good stuff. And that's what changes us. This morning I looked at this crowd of Christians, and they were everything, and they were really wanting to be, as they said, we just studied the Good Samaritan, and what the story said was, who is my neighbor is this question. I told them what they didn't know, that the lawyer in the story who asked the question, Jesus, the lawyer who asked that question, who is my neighbor, George was a Washington lawyer. Because I know that tone of voice. It wasn't, who is my neighbor, how can I help? It was, all right, now just who is my neighbor here? And the parable there is, your neighbor is somebody who's different than you. Somebody who's not like you. Doesn't look like you. Someone who's not like you. That's what the story. And so in this room, these people are all trying to see each other as their neighbors. So it's systemic in policing. There's a whole chapter here about what does it mean to move from warriors to guardians as police. Plato talked about guardians. You need that role. It's critical. Serve and protect. But too often our police are warriors, not guardians. That's a very different role. How do we reestablish trust in community? Brian Stevenson, who wrote the foreword to the book, Harvard lawyer, won 2 Supreme Court cases. He's the one responsible for ending this notion of that children who commit crimes before they're 18 can be sent to prison without parole for the rest of their lives. He changed that. He's gotten 110 people off death row. He's a smart guy. He's a lawyer, and he went home I said, write an essay about the subject, not just talk about the book, and he did. It's worth reading all by itself. And he said, the first paragraph is a story that he's told me about in depth one night going home in Atlanta, where he lived. I just told the story there. One night he's going home, and he had a long day. He's the nation's premier mass incarceration lawyer, I would say. Legal briefs all over the seat. He's tired, long day. He had more work to do, but he was just listening to some music on the way home. And he got to his house, and the music wasn't done, so he put his head back on his headrest and finishing up a little bit of Sly and the Family Stone. But in 10 minutes, there was a banging on the window right next to his head. He turned, and there was a white police officer with a gun, pointed at Brian Stevenson's head with saying, I'll use a church version, get out, if you don't get out of the effing car, I'll blow your effing head off. He gets out, he's a lawyer, he knows what to do. Here's my hands, not hiding anything. This is my house, I'm a lawyer, it's okay, no worries. Spread eagle him over the car for a long time in front of his neighbors, trying to humiliate him. Finally, he figured out he was Brian Stevenson, a lawyer. Did he say, I'm sorry, sir? He said, no. You're lucky this time. You're lucky this time. Now, we could raise hands around the room, and there'd be stories in this room. I see heads nodding. There'd be stories in the room. Does that matter to all of us or not? That becomes the question. So my My son's class, 5th grade, was studying immigration. The second to last chapter here is about that, immigration. So they had 2 dads come in. One dad was an immigration lawyer, and I was the other dad, and I was at that point fasting. We had this 31-day water fast to try and, right outside the Capitol, try to tell stories to members of Congress. And Obama came, and Joe Biden came, and lots of folks came. So I went and talked to class, and it turned out to be my most important talk about immigration, and there were a lot of them, because here's what happened. So this class, most of the boys I've coached in baseball, I told them about 11 million undocumented people. 11 million, who can't get the medical care that they need, or the police protection that they need, or their families are being broken up because of 1,000 deportations every day. And the kids were just incredulous. They just couldn't believe it. They were really upset. And they said, why don't we fix this? Why doesn't the Congress fix this? Have you talked to them? I said, yeah, we've talked to them. Well, why won't they fix it? Well, they say their constituencies are afraid. Why are they afraid? What are they afraid of? Say the kids. And I looked at them. John Eaton Elementary School, public school, 5th grade. And there they were, African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, white, Somali, Maltese, they were everything. And it hit me. I said, they're afraid of you. They're afraid of you. Why are they afraid of us? Because you look like what America's becoming. You look like the new America. And they're afraid of that. And they said, why? I said, because they say they don't think it's going to work. Tell me, I asked the kids, is it working? The kids say, yeah, it's really cool. I said, well, our job is to teach this nation that it's really cool. Now, at one of our stops, somebody said, maybe they're afraid that it will work. That it will work. A new generation, these crowds have been young, they've been interracial, they've been older, younger, intergenerational. A new generation is ready for this. And I think this is the place that we're now going. The demographics are clear. Building a bridge to a new America is now happening. And what we're going to do, particularly in the faith community, what we're going to do, are we going to help guide this? Are we going to help shape this? Are we going to help midwife this new birth? Is that going to be our role? Are we going to lead by example? Are we going to show the nation that, yeah, this is really cool and can really work? I'm not sure who else will if we don't in the faith community. How do we do that? That's what we're having these conversations about. I knew the book was going to be painfully timed. No matter when it came out, there would be painful things that would show how timely it is. And sure enough, we got Flint, right above my hometown of Detroit. Flint is teaching us the lesson that racism is in the air we breathe and the water that we drink. A black program director from Detroit called me the other day and she said, I'm so frustrated with all these white colleagues who say, yeah, but I'm not a racist. It's the wrong question. It's in the air we breathe and the water that we drink. So when candidates fill the air with racial fear and racial hate, they're poisoning the atmosphere. The atmosphere is being poisoned and polluted. But I think a whole lot of other folks black, brown, white. I think men and women, I think they want to clean the air and clean up the water. What does that begin to look like? Take responsibility for that. That's what we're having these conversations about. And they've been pretty exciting and I think pretty hopeful. But every time we have a conversation, we're about to have one here, there's always one young, usually a young black man or woman saying, I just love to hear this. I love to hear this kind of talk, but I'm not sure I have any hope that white people are going to ever see me or treat me the way that I'd like to be treated. Kid in Ferguson said, they ask me what you protesters want. And I want an education. I want a job. I want a family. What does my son Luke want? He's going to college next year. An education, a job, and a family. So that's where I think the role of the faith community really comes in here, because our scriptures say that in Hebrews, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And my best paraphrase of that is still, hope means believing in spite of the evidence, and then watching the evidence change. We're looking at the evidence here that's pretty clear. No one has yet to say those facts aren't right. The evidence isn't clear. The only question is, are we willing to repent, turn around, go in a whole new direction, clean up the air, and clean up the water? I think we can, I think we must, and I hope we will. Thank you very much.
We have time for dialogue. Before we do that, I want to thank the church administrator, Miss Newton, for her help. She's a very, very skilled person. And everyone, Bettina, the pastor's wife, helped, and Jessica Wilson, who is leaving our town to go to work for Homeland Security in Washington. She's a La Jolla Country Day person, helped. So we never take for granted the people who help, the custodians and the people that help with the setup. So we have time. Who would like to make a comment or ask a question?
Don't be shy.
Here, yes, yes. Tell us your name.
My name is Tracy.
Hi, Trace.
I think when you say how are we going to change this, and it has to come up from our faith community, I agree with that. And we just, I think we have to have more leadership not being afraid to talk about it in our churches.
You need to repeat. How do we change it? You're saying, I think we need to have less fear to talk about it in our churches. Well, that's why I wrote this thing. And we actually have a study guide with lots of, like my teams, we have many great videos and resources so that in universities, colleges, small groups, churches, workplaces, people can sit down and really talk about this together. And my experience is that when you do that, it really does work. When I was in college many years ago, I was at Michigan State University, land-grant college. So we had these really rural kids. And what Jimmy Carville once said about Pennsylvania is true of Michigan. You got Detroit and Flint and Jackson, and the rest of it's Alabama or Mississippi. It really is. Rural Michigan's a very conservative place. And so I remember I was a student activist, and I would get literally death threats in my dorm room at night. It's a tough place. But I had all these rural kids. I had this kid on hockey scholarship from Sudbury, Ontario, where they have, I think, 14 people in Sudbury. He was this huge kid playing hockey. Then I had young guys from Detroit who always carried around boom boxes. Remember boom boxes were very loud, so they'd meet in the hallway. Really interesting, you know? So I said, okay, guys, we're going to start having Tuesday nights in my room. I was the RA, resident assistant. In my room, we're going to have a conversation. It's going to be honest. I'm going to moderate, but it's going to be open, honest, but civil. It's going to be fair, and I want you guys to hear each other's stories. And they came, and they came. Before long, we're in the hallway, and more came, filled the hallway. Every Tuesday night, there was a big conversation between these kids, white and black kids. And it was amazing how when they heard each other's stories, they began to listen. Oh, really? Huh. That happened to you? Huh. Really? And when a bunch of racial conflict broke out in the spring, different part of campus, it didn't happen on our part of the campus because they'd all been talking together. In fact, they decided to go over there and help the other kids have a conversation. So I think we could do that, but we'd have to be intentional about it. Because finally, it's easy just to talk to each other. That's what's easiest. But I think we could have serious between churches, among churches, and talking with kids on the street, which is really interesting. I love going to Ferguson and talking to those young people in the street. They're not anti-church. They're just looking for some church folks to have some courage and join them in the streets, you know. So I think we can do that.
Tell us, how many times have you been arrested?
I had to count that up. I got asked by my Georgetown students. 22. Part of what Brian talks about, I love his word, proximity. What changes us is proximity, you know. So I'm in Detroit, a 15-year-old kid, and I'm now listening in my city. I'm reading the papers, I'm watching the news, I'm having conversations, asking questions. How can we live the way we do in white Detroit, and life seems so different from what I'm hearing in black Detroit? How come? And nobody would talk about it in my white world of church and school, and nobody talked about it. So I went into the city, and this story is in the book. The first chapter is race is a story. All of us have a story, right? Mine is I went into the city, and I took jobs alongside young guys who were born in the same city as me, but I was white and they were black, and I realized after we got talking and became friends that we had been raised in two different countries in the same city. And so Butch became a friend. We were janitors at the Detroit Edison, moving lots of heavy furniture, feeling real strong. My money's going for college, and his is going to support his family. Takes me home to meet his mom one night. His dad had passed. And so I had dinner at their house, and she said she wasn't militant or political at all, like my mom, was worried about her son's ideas getting him into trouble, though, and as my mom was at that point. And she said, so here's what I tell my kids. If you're lost, can't find your way home, and you see a policeman, duck under a stairwell, hide behind a building. When he passes, come back out and find your way home. And when she said that, my mother's words echoed in my head, what she said to her 5 kids. I can remember it as vividly as she said it 50 years ago. If you're ever lost, can't find your way home, look for a policeman. The policeman's your friend, take you by the hand, bring you home. When people, like in Simi Valley, when they tell each other their stories, things begin to happen. So, yeah, and partly being in jail, sometimes I visit prisoners, sometimes I am one, but, you know, to be in jail with a kid, you know, you're overcrowded DC jails. They're pretty nasty. Used to be a gymnasium, now it's 60 guys in bunks on a gym floor, sharing one toilet. And the kid next to me looks like about 14. He's got to be 18, I think, because he's in there. He got picked up for a bus transfer violation. That's when people run up, kids say, transfer, and if someone's got a transfer they don't need, they hand it out the window. Kid takes the transfer, gets in the bus. Police are in the bushes picking up kids for bus transfer violations. Then the public defender comes once, kid's lost his card, never had a phone call. His grandparents who raised him don't even know what's happened to him. $100 bail, he can't make a $100 bail. He's in DC jail for 3 months, waiting trial. Now, that kid, that baby-faced kid, in that room with 60 guys, he's a different person when he gets out. So I got out a few days later, and I called his grandparents, and we got him out of jail. But proximity is what we often lack. And Brian explains how proximity changes us. Proximity to other people is what changes our worldview.
The president I want to ask about, you have a close relationship with the president. He turns to you not infrequently. Can you kind of explain for us what you think his presidency has meant in terms of this dynamic of race?
My book is dedicated to Vincent Harding, who was in Dr. King's inner circle in the Southern Freedom Movement. He's been an elder and mentor to me for a long time. In my house, he's Uncle Vincent. He passed last year, but he came to the inauguration. He's also an amazing historian of the civil rights movement and black history. Generally, he came to join us for the inauguration in 2008. And so my kids are getting commentary from Vincent Harding about the meaning of the first black president elected, which was a powerful thing for my kids just to listen to Uncle Vincent talk about it. And Vincent and I, we were both surprised that Obama won. I was kind of same place a lot of the old black folks in D.C. who just couldn't believe this was going to happen in our lifetime. I had a house full election night of 20-somethings, and they were all out dancing in the streets. They were sure it was going to happen. I was watching the TV because if all the undecided voters had gone against Obama, he would have lost. And so I'm watching, and until when Pennsylvania finally went for Obama, that did it. And I just sat there by myself, and I wept. And Vincent lives in Denver, and we were there for the convention where he got nominated. We said to each other, maybe this country is in a better place than we thought it was. And in some ways it was. We hardly had any other country, Peru, that nominated a president from a minority race, but we did. But the backlash against Barack Obama has even stunned him. Because it's one thing to disagree with his policies, which I do sometimes. We have a vigorous conversation about a lot of things, about being stronger on poverty and other things. However, the hatred toward him is personal because he represents that new demographic. He symbolizes that a president named Barack Hussein Obama just works up all of the fear and the hatred in so many white folks in this country. And I think it's been stunning in how when the leader of the Senate starts the first week saying, our job is to defeat him, to make him fail. First week on the job. So yeah, I think that this is all behind that hatred of Obama. It's also behind why immigration reform hasn't passed yet. When a candidate launches his campaign by calling immigrants racists and criminals and demonizing immigrants as you launch your campaign, and then banning Muslims from coming into the country, a whole world religion, and a lot of people are afraid. And a lot of white folks saying, yeah, he can say it, I guess I can say it too. No more nuance, right? So the whole conversation has been shifting. So I think he's accomplished a number of things, but he's really been surrounded by people who don't get it. And he's been opposed at a deeper level than he even expected. And we're going to see it now in this latest battle over the Supreme Court. So, yeah, I think he was startled by how deep it was. But he found his voice, found himself in Charleston when he gave that speech, and he broke into Amazing Grace. He kind of found himself and his voice again in a way that I love to see.
You know what, maybe Pat, at the end, we're going to do a couple more. Maybe Pat will come and lead us in Amazing Grace, but this woman, yes ma'am.
I just wanted to address your thing on proximity and a microcosm sense. My daughter who's 45 now, she went to Gompers Secondary School, which was part of the magnet program, and in her section of these kids that went from 7th through 12th grade, it was 25% white, 25% black, 25% Asian, and 25% Hispanic. And those kids, through all that time, were very supportive of one another and still keep in contact. So the proximity in that microcosm, because you are exposed to other people, you begin to have this thing of respect, and you don't see color, you see a person. So I was just addressing that as a small example.
The rabbi in Chicago I mentioned to the rabbi here is working with the school in Evanston, Illinois, which is very diverse. And she called it drive-by diversity, where the metrics show it's diverse. But the kids really weren't getting involved with each other. They were still splitting up around race. They took them on a pilgrimage to the South, all the civil rights, places and movements, all the venues. And the kids were still sitting on different sides of the bus and so on, all getting along, but not really. And so they made this thing where you had to have a partner from a different race, a partner, a buddy system the whole way to talk about what you were seeing, reflect on it together, and really go through it all together. So, and that really worked. So this young white girl and this young African-American young man were partners on the trip, and they got back to Evanston School, and one day in class, they're in the same class, and they're leaving class. She told the story in the room. They're leaving class, and the teacher said to the young black man who just picked up his phone to look at his phone, walking out of class, "You're looking at your phone while you're in class. That's against the rules. Go to the principal." And the young white girl says, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa. I've been listening to music the entire hour, and you saw that, and you didn't call me out. Why are you calling him out? Okay, you go to the principal too." So, but they had the kind of relationship where she wasn't going to accept him being called out when she wasn't being called out. And little things like that change worldview and perspective. So the teacher said, "Okay, I'll get you too," So, did you have a quick question?
I didn't have a question.
Comment?
Comment.
Please.
Is that everything that you said, I related to. And I think that this room should probably be filled with other African American pastors and clergy members. And one of the things that we have to start with is if we're going to start a movement, Black Lives Matter, and just a movement in the church, we're going to have to come together and feel uncomfortable sitting in a room with others that don't look like us.
Mm-hmm.
I thank my friend Jon Stewart for inviting me this evening. I only found out through Jon that this was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to pass this around to every black clergy member and other clergy members throughout the city.
Mm-hmm.
As you were relating about the 17-year-old in the talk, I have two sons, 20 and 17, and a daughter. I've had to have the talk with all of them.
All of them, right.
Because black girls are no longer safe than black boys.
Mm-hmm.
We are finding that you're right, it is in the air. It's in the water. And we have to have dialogue with people that we don't normally have dialogue with. It's tough for us to have dialogue with one another sometimes. But we really have to start to integrate our churches. Because in a lot of ways, it's still like Dr. King talked about.
Yeah, it is.
On Sunday morning.
Yep.
On Sunday evening. It's still like that. And I've also had the experience of working in Washington at the highest levels, and then finding myself on the ground with a police gun saying, yes, I do have the weapon, and yes, I do have the credentials to carry this weapon. It did not matter. And then after they got all the credentials, the officer that had me said, I'm not going to say I'm sorry. So we still have those experiences that are going on throughout America. And I agree with you 100%. Unless the church, who for many years sat silent during slavery, sat silent during apartheid, sat silent, starts to speak up, then we are hopeless.
I think pulpits and congregations are supposed to change communities and nations and history. So I'll be preaching in Ebenezer on the anniversary of King's death. That pulpit changed this country. I was in a pulpit in Ferguson where Starsky Wilson was one of the first pastors to go on the streets with the kids. That pulpit's changing St. Louis. So if you believe that pulpits, and we've both been to John Wesley's church in central London. I got to preach there one time, and to be in a pulpit where conversion to Christ was integrally linked to joining the anti-slavery campaign. People would sign up the same night as their conversion. Pulpits are supposed to change communities and nations, but we have to do what you're talking about. We have to finally come together, and it is uncomfortable. Listen to each other, tell the stories. But I think, if we say what we believe about our faith, Robert Franklin, wonderful president of Morehouse, now runs Chautauqua, he moderated the meeting in New York, old friend. Got to Chicago, and this young African-American pastor gets up to do the prayer, and he says, we're going to pray with our eyes open. Why don't you look around, see who's here. Look around, see how diverse this room is. These are the people we have to see and know and talk to. He was Franklin's son. Now he's a pastor in Hyde Park. So that's the conversation we need to have. My experience is that we can do that, but we have to do it very intentionally.
Patricia is going to come and lead us in Amazing Grace. I want Jim to make his way to the table where he will be happy to sign your books. I'm going to end by quoting 1 John chapter 4, verse 20, which reads, if you say you love God whom you have not seen, but do not love your brothers and sisters whom you have seen, you are a liar. Let's stand, and Patricia will lead us in Amazing Grace.
She has a sister over there that had a question over there on the other side. There was a lady that had a question.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see.
Thank you, everyone. Christ United Presbyterian, La Jolla Country Day, Temple Emmanuel, School of Christian Studies, this church, and all of you. God bless you. Have a great President's Day tomorrow. Good night.